Keir Starmer's Middle East gamble sparks a political firestorm. Just as Prime Minister Keir Starmer was gearing up for a diplomatic visit to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, a seismic shift shook the Middle East, the fall of Bashar al-Assad's 24-year regime. Starmer wasted no time hailing the collapse of what he called a brutal and barbaric regime, but questions linger over the UK's next move and who exactly it will negotiate with in Syria's fractured political landscape. And wait until you hear what Starmer won't say about controversial rebel factions controlling the region now.
I welcome the fact that Assad has gone. The Syrian people had to put up with his brutal regime for far, far too long. We're talking to regional allies. It's very important now that there's a political settlement, a political way forward, and it's very, very important that we emphasise that civilians and minorities must be protected in this process, but very, very pleased that Assad has fallen.
Keir Starmer's words were clear. The fall of Bashar al-Assad marked a pivotal moment for the Middle East. Yet as the dust settles in Syria, the situation grows murkier by the day. For over 2 decades, Assad's regime ruled with an iron fist, suppressing dissent and clinging to power through brutality. Starmer's statement that Syrians have endured his barbaric regime for far too long reflects the sentiments of many in the international community. However, the question now is, what comes next? As Starmer embarked on his diplomatic visit to the Gulf, ostensibly to strengthen economic ties with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the timing could not have been more politically charged. What was once a straightforward mission to secure Britain's £3.8 billion defence exports to Saudi Arabia has now been overshadowed by the region's sudden instability. Downing Street announced that Starmer will use this visit to deepen defence and security ties with the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but insiders reveal that the Syrian crisis is now an unavoidable part of the agenda. The collapse of Assad's government, while celebrated by some, has created a power vacuum that could destabilize the region even further. Rebel groups, including the controversial Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, have taken control of key areas. HTS, previously known as the Nusra Front, was once an offshoot of al-Qaeda, before severing those ties in 2016. Despite their attempts to rebrand as a legitimate force, they remain listed as a terrorist organization by the US and Russia. Starmer, for his part, has avoided directly addressing whether the UK would engage with such factions, instead calling for a political settlement that protects civilians and minorities while rejecting terrorism and violence. Critics argue that this vagueness leaves the UK without a clear strategy. Conservative MP Richard Fuller didn't mince words when he warned on GB News that Starmer's approach risked backfiring. The Prime Minister's words may sound principled, but where's the substance? If we're not careful, we'll end up entangled in a conflict where Britain has no allies we can trust. The stakes are high. For years, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have played complex roles in Syria. Both nations initially opposed Assad's regime, with Saudi Arabia even providing financial and military support to various rebel groups after the Syrian civil war erupted in 2011. However, in recent years, the dynamics have shifted. Assad was readmitted to the Arab League just last year, a move that underscored the growing pragmatism of Gulf leaders. The UAE re-established ties with Syria in 2018, and Saudi Arabia followed suit, hosting Assad in Riyadh for a high-profile visit. Now, with Assad gone, both countries will need to recalibrate their strategies, and the UK is scrambling to keep up. This uncertainty extends to Britain's own foreign policy. While Starmer's statements about rejecting terrorism are laudable, the reality is far more complicated. Groups like HTS control significant territory in Syria, and their influence cannot be ignored. Yet acknowledging or negotiating with such factions risks alienating Britain's Western allies and drawing criticism at home. The question of whether Britain should engage with these groups is already sparking fierce debate among policymakers. In the meantime, Starmer faces mounting criticism from the opposition. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage wasted no time attacking the Prime Minister's handling of the situation. Speaking to GB News, Farage accused Starmer of foreign policy grandstanding while failing to address domestic issues. The British public doesn't care about Starmer's hollow words on Syria, Farage declared. They care about securing their own borders and fixing the mess at home. Farage's populist rhetoric is striking a chord with disillusioned voters. Reform UK's recent surge in the polls is proof of that. In the latest Techni UK survey, the party climbed to 21%, putting them within striking distance of Labour's 27% and the Conservatives' 25%. Reform's chairman, Zia Yousaf, boasted that the party is polling ahead of Labour in key areas, despite having just 5 MPs and a fraction of Labour's resources. The British people want real change after years of failure and deception, Yousaf said. With reform gaining momentum, Farage's critique of Starmer's foreign policy could become a rallying cry for voters who feel disconnected from Westminster politics. Back in the Middle East, Starmer's challenges are compounded by the broader geopolitical context. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Iran, a key backer of Assad's regime, has thawed in recent months, despite their long-standing rivalry. This rapprochement complicates Britain's efforts to navigate the region's shifting alliances. How can the UK support Saudi Arabia's position while also maintaining its own stance against terrorism and violence? The answer remains elusive. Critics of Starmer argue that his trip to the Gulf, while well-intentioned, has exposed the limits of his diplomatic skill. Tory MP Kemi Badenoch suggested that the Prime Minister is out of his depth when it comes to managing complex international crises. "We need a leader who can make tough decisions and stand firm," Badenoch said. "Instead, we have someone who speaks in platitudes and hopes for the best." Meanwhile, Downing Street insists that Starmer's visit is a success, pointing to his meetings with Saudi and Emirati officials as evidence of Britain's enduring influence in the region. A spokesperson emphasised that the Prime Minister is committed to fostering economic growth and security partnerships that benefit both the UK and its allies. However, these assurances do little to quell the growing unease at home. The fallout from Assad's collapse is far from over, and the UK's role in shaping Syria's future is still uncertain. Will Starmer's call for a political settlement lead to meaningful progress, or will it be dismissed as empty rhetoric? As the situation unfolds, one thing is clear. The stakes have never been higher for Britain's foreign policy and for Keir Starmer's leadership. And as if the international drama weren't enough, Starmer also faces political turbulence at home. The rise of Reform UK threatens to upend the traditional party dynamics, with Nigel Farage positioning himself as a credible alternative to both Labour and the Conservatives. Reform's populist message resonates with voters who feel alienated by the status quo, and their growing support in the polls could spell trouble for Starmer's Labour Party. Farage, never one to shy away from bold claims, is already predicting Reform's continued ascent. "We're just getting started," he declared in a recent interview. "The British people are tired of being ignored, and they're ready for real change." Whether Reform can maintain its momentum remains to be seen, but their surge in popularity underscores the dissatisfaction many voters feel with the current political landscape. For Keir Starmer, the challenges are piling up. Balancing Britain's foreign policy ambitions with domestic political pressures is no easy task, and the Prime Minister's ability to navigate these turbulent waters will be put to the test in the coming weeks. Will Starmer rise to the occasion, or will his handling of the Syrian crisis and the growing threat from Reform UK expose cracks in his leadership? One thing's for certain, this is a political drama that's far from over.